How is it possible that the man who carried God's eternal plan played such a small role in the Bible? Isaac did not part seas, did not see ladders to heaven, did not fight wars, nor meet warrior angels. Yet without him, the promise would not stand. It would have passed from Abraham straight to Jacob. Isaac was the silent link in a divine chain, the patriarch almost everyone forgets, but without whom the story would not exist. Chosen. His story is a mystery hidden between the lines, a life of quiet obedience, of simple yet eternal decisions. And most astonishing of all, Isaac was not merely an heir, he was a prophetic figure, a shadow of the Messiah to come. Why would God choose a man without visible accomplishments to sustain such a grand promise? What you are about to learn about Isaac will shake everything you thought you knew about the patriarchs. And if this kind of message touches your soul as it touches ours, subscribe now and share this video with someone. The story they never told you is here. The sun mercilessly scorched the vast plains of Canaan, where the days burned fiercely and the nights brought a piercing cold that reached the bone. There, within that hostile land, lived a man named Abraham. He was no longer young, and neither was his wife Sarah. The glow of youth had left them both. In fact, they had already crossed the threshold of old age. Abraham was 99 years old, and Sarah, his faithful companion, was 89. Their bodies had withered. Time had stolen their youth, but not their hope. Though at times it seemed to slip away. Abraham had emerged decades earlier in Ur of the Chaldeans, driven by a voice not of this world, a voice promising unseen lands and descendants as numerous as the stars above. As the years passed, the promise remained alive, though increasingly distant, increasingly improbable. Sarah's womb stayed barren like the desert dust, and old age wrapped itself around them like an irreversible cloak. Yet the God who had called him was no ordinary God, but the God of the impossible, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence things that are not, as though they already were. On a quiet afternoon, while Abraham rested at the entrance of his tent, 3 men appeared before him. One of them, radiant, was no mere traveler. Abraham bowed to the ground, sensing a sacred presence. It was the Lord. In that divine encounter, a startling declaration shook Abraham's soul. "I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah, listening from inside the tent, could not contain a laugh. It was not laughter of joy, but disbelief, a mixture of skepticism and resignation. How could an elderly woman whose body no longer knew the rhythms of life conceive a child? But the Lord heard her and answered with a question that thundered in their minds. Is anything too hard for God? It was not a rebuke, but a statement, a challenge to the limits of human reason. Soon after, Sarah's body began to change in ways defying logic. Her once faded face flushed without reason. She felt morning sickness. Women she had never known began visiting her. Step by step, the promise unfolded before her eyes. Life sprouted in barren soil, like a flower blooming in the sand. And at the appointed time, Sarah gave birth to a son. Abraham held him with awe and tenderness. He named him Isaac. Laughter, not out of mockery, but because God had turned disbelief into joy. His very name carried the memory of a moment when the impossible became real, the echo of a laughter redeemed by the faithfulness of the Most High. Isaac was not an ordinary child. He was the child of promise, the heir of the eternal covenant God had made with Abraham. His birth did not come from human desire, nor from the power of the flesh, but by direct intervention from heaven. It was a divine declaration. God chooses whom he wills, regardless of circumstances. Why Isaac and not Ishmael, the son born of Hagar? Because God did not want the promise built by human effort. Ishmael was born from an attempt to help God. Isaac was born from rest in faith. Through him, God taught that his faithfulness depends not on our strength, but on our trust. Isaac's story began wrapped in mystery and power. He was a living sign, a proof that when God makes a promise, he himself fulfills it. His birth was not merely a miraculous act, but also a prophetic declaration. The chosen people would be born from the impossible, rise from the improbable, and their existence would, from the very beginning, proclaim God's power over human barrenness. And as the child grew beneath the starry skies of Canaan, surrounded by tents, livestock, and the stories told by his elderly father, the world still did not understand that something extraordinary was beginning to unfold in that infant. An invisible thread of history was being woven, a story that would change the course of humanity forever. The wind blew softly between the tents, carrying the smell of livestock and freshly baked bread. In that encampment spreading across the plains of the Negev, news spread like wildfire. Sarah, the elderly wife of the patriarch Abraham, had given birth to a son. Former disbelief turned into joy, resounding like a song of victory. Shepherds, servants, elders, and women approached the tent in reverent awe. All wanted to see with their own eyes the child born of a miracle, the impossible son God had promised. Sarah, her eyes shining with tears and laughter, held the newborn in her arms and looked at him with profound tenderness, like someone who finds an unexpected jewel in old age. "God has made me laugh," she said, "and all who hear of this will laugh with me." Nay, this was the boy's name, Isaac, a living symbol that God not only fulfills his promises, but does so with grace that turns sorrow into joy. Isaac's birth was not an ordinary event. It was not simply a barren woman conceiving, but the visible confirmation of an eternal covenant between God and Abraham. It was as though every cell of the child's body proclaimed a spiritual truth. What is born of God is not born only of flesh, but also of spirit. 8 days after his birth, the camp gathered again, this time to fulfill an ancestral rite marking the identity of God's people: circumcision. Abraham, his hands hardened by age but guided by obedience, performed the act himself. That small cut was more than tradition. It signified Isaac's separation from the world, a physical mark of the eternal covenant. From that moment on, Isaac was not only the child of the miracle, but the first child of the promise, a sign of the covenant from birth. Circumcision on the 8th day was no accident. In Hebrew culture, the number 8 symbolizes a new beginning. The 7th day ends the cycle of creation and rest. The 8th represents what lies beyond human time, a divine beginning. Isaac, marked that day, became evidence of a new beginning for humanity, a step toward the formation of a nation whose foundation would be faith. As Isaac took his first hesitant steps and uttered curious sounds, another child lived in the same camp, Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, the Egyptian servant. Ishmael, now a strong and alert teenager, had been the patriarch's only son until then. For years, Abraham had loved and raised him, believing that perhaps he was the heir of the promise. He had prayed for him, waited for him, and even circumcised him. But everything had changed. Isaac was different, not because Abraham loved Ishmael less, but because the divine promise was intertwined with Isaac's very bones. A subtle silence settled over the camp, soft at first, then louder with time. Sarah watched cautiously, her gaze, though tender, fixed on Isaac whenever Ishmael was near. There was uneasiness in her heart, a dark premonition that the servant's son might become a threat to the son of the promise. The relationship between the brothers was ambiguous. To Isaac, Ishmael was simply the older boy who ran faster, threw stones with precision, laughed loudly, and told thrilling stories. But in Ishmael, silent resentment began to grow. He was no longer the center of attention. He noticed how every eye turned to the boy called the miracle. Spiritually, the atmosphere of the camp shifted. Tents whispered more than cloth could contain. Servants murmured as they passed. Abraham, though still loving Ishmael, understood that God was drawing a different path. Isaac was not merely his son. He was the beginning of a lineage that would lead to greater promises. Day after day, little Isaac grew surrounded by songs, stories, and teachings. Abraham told him about the God who had called him from Ur, about the Most High who walked with him among the oaks of Mamre, about the God who spoke, and the heavens opened and came down among men. Isaac listened with wide eyes and open soul. From cradle to first steps, his entire existence breathed faith. He was raised by faith, but born of a miracle. Isaac not only carried the name of redeemed laughter, he was living proof that what God begins, he sustains. And though unaware of his own magnitude, each day beneath the stars of Canaan echoed the eternal covenant, a step toward a nation that did not yet exist, but already beat in the heart of God. The sun rose strong over Abraham's camp. Sheep bleated in the distance. Servants carried jars of water. Shepherds began their day. Yet in the main tent, the air was heavy, thicker than the desert heat. Despite days of joy after Isaac's birth, emotional fractures appeared. Sarah, still astonished to be a mother in old age, watched the children at play, Isaac and Ishmael, with suspicion. Little Isaac, only a few years old, babbled and laughed as he followed his half-brother, a vigorous and daring teenager. But the situation was not simple. It was a moment of play that sparked the fire. During the celebration of Isaac's weaning, when a great feast was held, Sarah saw Ishmael laughing, but not with joy. It was laughter of mockery, veiled contempt, the kind of laughter born of wounded pride. Sarah's eyes, hardened by life, did not ignore it. The tension inside her broke like a storm. She turned to Abraham with unwavering resolve. "Drive out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave will not share the inheritance with my son, with Isaac." Abraham felt a weight like stone in his chest. He loved Isaac, but Ishmael was his blood. He had raised him, taught him to walk, to hunt, to build altars. The thought of sending him away was crushing. Quietly, the patriarch withdrew, seeking comfort and direction from the one who had guided him since the days of Ur. That night, as the stars shone over the desert and the wind whispered among the tents, God spoke to Abraham with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Do not be distressed because of the boy and your servant. Listen to Sarah in everything she tells you, for it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. And as for the son of the servant, I will also make him into a nation, because he is your descendant." With these words, God not only confirmed Sarah's decision, but strongly reaffirmed the channel through which the promise would flow. It was not a matter of favoritism, but of divine election. Isaac was the child of the promise, the bearer of the covenant, the lineage through whom the redemptive plan would come. Ishmael, though blessed, would not be the heir. At daybreak, with a broken heart, Abraham rose, took bread and a skin of water, and gave them to Hagar. He placed the water skin on her shoulder and entrusted the boy to her. Though already a teenager, he was still under his mother's care. They parted in silence. The silence between them spoke louder than any words. Hagar, with tears in her eyes, looked one last time at the man who had been her master and protector, and then walked into the wilderness of Beersheba. The midday sun was relentless. The water ran out quickly, and Hagar, fearing for her son's life, laid him under a bush and moved away. "So I will not have to see the boy die. I cannot watch the child die," she said, weeping. But in the midst of that moment of despair, something extraordinary happened. God heard the boy's voice. The angel of the Lord called to Hagar from heaven and said, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the boy from where he is. Get up, take the boy by the hand and hold him fast, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. Thus Hagar and Ishmael survived, and the boy grew, became strong, and lived in the wilderness. This scene, heavy with human emotion, carries deep prophetic symbolism. Isaac and Ishmael do not represent merely two children, but two paths. One is the fruit of human effort, impatience, and the attempt to hasten the fulfillment of a promise. The other is born of faith and supernatural intervention. Ishmael represents the flesh, the law, the slavery of human attempts to reach the divine. Isaac, on the other hand, is a figure of grace, fulfillment through faith, and spiritual freedom. The separation between them was not simply a family decision, it was an eternal teaching. In the days of Paul, centuries later, this same story would be used as an illustration of two covenants, one given at Sinai, which bears children into slavery, and another born of promise, which bears children into freedom. The apostle, writing to the Galatians, would cite this very episode to show that the children of the promise cannot share the inheritance with the children of spiritual bondage. That day in the desert, with a wounded heart and a steady gaze, Abraham obeyed God and divided his household. It was a painful act, yes, but also a declaration of trust. The one who had promised Isaac would also care for Ishmael. And although the paths of the two brothers separated, they would follow different roads, both still carrying in their blood the lineage of Abraham. Yet only one would bear the eternal covenant, Isaac, the child who brought laughter. He would grow up in a home where the weight of the promise was as real as the dust of the desert. Each day of his life would remind him that he existed not by chance, but by divine design. And while Ishmael walked away toward other lands and other destinies, in Abraham's tent remained the true heir, the child marked by God, the living symbol of a promise that would only end when it reached its final fulfillment. Years passed, and the miraculous child grew. Isaac was no longer the boy who laughed in Sarah's tent, but a strong, calm, and obedient young man whose life unfolded under the shadow of the faith his father had firmly instilled in him. The atmosphere in the camp had changed since Ishmael's departure. It was calmer, yes, but also more focused. Now every eye was fixed on him, Isaac, the only son of the promise, the heir of the covenant. Abraham instructed him in the ways of the Most High, and every day they rose together to worship, to learn, and to tend the flocks. Father and son shared not only blood, but the inner fire of devotion. Then, on one of those days, the voice of God once again resounded over Abraham's life. But this time it brought no new promises, no comforting words. It brought a command, a test more painful than any trial the human heart could imagine. Now, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. Silence fell like thunder. The command was clear, but the conflict in Abraham's heart overflowed. God was asking him to sacrifice the very son he had promised, the child born of the miracle, the heir of everything. Was it a contradiction, a divine mistake, a hidden test? Abraham did not ask questions. He did not argue. He did not delay. He rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, cut the wood for the burnt offering, and took with him 2 servants and Isaac. The journey to Moriah began in silence. They walked for 3 days that must have felt like an eternity to Abraham. 3 days during which his heart guarded a secret that burned like fire. Isaac, unaware of the true weight of that moment, walked confidently at his father's side, simply intent on obeying. When they finally saw the mountain in the distance, Abraham said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." These words were more than an attempt to remain calm. They were a prophetic declaration. Abraham did not know how, but he believed that his son would return with him. He believed that the God who brought life from a dead womb could, if necessary, bring life back from the dead. As they climbed the slope together, Isaac carried the wood on his shoulders, a powerful, silent image, full of meaning. Abraham carried the fire and the knife. The silence was broken by the innocent voice of the young man. "My father, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Everything inside Abraham trembled. Even so, his voice, though shaken, answered with the certainty that only faith can give. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Isaac asked no further questions. There were no complaints, no resistance. The young man went up to the summit with his father, devoted and trusting. When the altar was built and the wood arranged, the most astonishing thing was not only that Abraham obeyed, but that Isaac obeyed as well. He allowed himself to be bound, allowed himself to be laid upon the altar. He did not fight, did not flee, did not scream. In that moment, Isaac ceased to be merely Abraham's son and revealed himself as a true believer, a genuine worshipper. The text does not record his thoughts, but it does record his obedient silence. Isaac's story reflects the heart of someone who understood the will of God. Even when it is mysterious, it is always perfect. And so, when the knife was raised in the air, at the very moment the act seemed inevitable, a voice thundered from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the boy, do him no harm. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham lifted his eyes and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. He took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. On that mountain, Abraham named that place Yed-buh-jireh, that is, the Lord will provide. That day, an eternal truth was sealed forever. God does not demand human sacrifice to accomplish his plan. He himself provides the necessary sacrifice. This episode was not merely a moment of extreme obedience. It was a prophetic revelation, a scene filled with symbols pointing to the centuries ahead. Isaac carrying the wood on his back is a clear foreshadowing of the Messiah to come, Jesus Christ, who would likewise carry upon his shoulders the wood of sacrifice. Both went up in obedience. Both yielded voluntarily. Both were beloved sons. But where the knife was stopped in Isaac's case, in Christ's there was no interruption. The sacrifice was fully consummated. The difference is holy. Isaac was a sacrifice that never came to pass, because he was reserved for a greater purpose. God restrained Abraham's hand, because that was not the time nor the place for a definitive sacrifice. Yet that altar on Moriah became a living promise of what would happen many centuries later on a nearby hill, when the true lamb would be slain for the sins of the world. This is the spiritual secret burned into that altar: substitution. On Moriah, God did not simply test Abraham to measure his faith. He unveiled his plan of redemption. The Son of Man was not meant to be the final test. He would be the one who died for sin. God himself would provide the lamb. Isaac came down from the mountain alive, not as a victim, but as a witness of a heavenly truth. From that day on, his existence took on a new meaning. He was not merely heir to material promises. He became the symbol of a faith that transcends generations. His life, marked by the altar, walked as a prophetic shadow of the coming Redeemer. Thus Moriah did not become the place of death, but the mountain of revelation, an altar without human blood, yet full of divine glory, a sacrifice that did not happen there because one had already been reserved, unique, perfect, eternal, and sufficient. The sky still held traces of the fading fire on the horizon as Abraham and his son Isaac began to descend the mountain of Moriah. No words passed between them, no explanations, no questions, only steady, quiet steps marked by an invisible weight that hung in the air like a thick mantle. The silence was not awkward, it was sacred, a pause in time, as though the universe itself held its breath before the mystery it had just witnessed. The servants were waiting below, beside the donkey. When they saw the two return together, they noticed something on their faces they could not explain. There were no wounds, no blood, but there was something different, a new expression in Abraham, as of a man who had stood in the presence of the eternal, and a calm glow in Isaac's eyes, as though he had crossed an invisible threshold. The young man walked as usual, but inside something had changed forever. Scripture does not record Isaac's words upon returning. His silence became a powerful voice. Some might imagine it was the silence of trauma, the silence of a son who had been bound, who saw the knife lifted above him, who came within a breath of being consumed by a fire that never burned. But that does not seem to be the silence Isaac carried. It is more like the silence of contemplation, the silence of one who, having looked into the abyss, discovered the face of God in his rescue. The Bible, as precise in its silences as in its words, does not say that Isaac protested. nor that he distanced himself from his father, nor that he rejected the God who had asked for him as an offering. Instead, we see him remaining with Abraham, continuing as heir, growing in stature and in faith. His silence does not arise from fear, but from awe, a kind of silence known only to those who have been touched by the divine and returned with a marked soul. And why a ram? Why that animal? Of all the creatures God could have provided, it was precisely a ram that appeared as substitute. The ram, caught by its horns in the thicket, was not there by chance. It was God's provision, the exact substitute, placed in the right place at the right time. Unlike a young lamb, a ram is mature, strong, and resilient. It represents a voluntary and powerful surrender, restrained strength offered in sacrifice. That ram was not merely a way out for Isaac. It was a message burned into history. The sacrifice God accepts is not the one man chooses, but the one he provides. Substitutionary sacrifice becomes, at that moment, the central pillar of divine revelation. Isaac should have died, but he did not. In his place, another was offered. This truth would echo throughout the history of God's people and reach its climax centuries later, when, on another hill not far from Moriah, another beloved son would carry the wood upon himself and climb in obedience to the altar of the cross. Isaac's figure then deepens. He was not only a rescued boy, he was a prototype, a messianic type. Isaac was the son given by the father, who carried the wood of sacrifice on his back, who climbed the mountain without resistance, who was laid upon the altar. But unlike Christ, his life was spared. Thus, in Isaac, we see the son who died and rose again in figure, as the author of Hebrews would later write, considering that God is able to raise even from the dead, and that, in a figurative sense, Abraham received him back. This symbolic resurrection marked Isaac's destiny. From that day forward, he walked with a different awareness. He knew his life was not his own. He had stood at the edge of death and returned. He had felt the weight of sacrifice, but also the breath of pardon. In a mysterious way, he was a resurrected man, and as such, every step he took was an echo of gratitude. Every unspoken word was an act of reverence. Abraham, in turn, also descended changed. He was no longer only the man who believed God when he promised a son, but the man who gave that son back, believing that even in death, God would still keep his promises. Both father and son came down from the mountain, not with less, but with more faith, more vision, more communion with the eternal. And so, the silence that wrapped their return was not emptiness, but a sanctuary, a space where faith was carved slowly, like metal in the fire. A space where the knife did not fall on flesh, but fell on pride, control, and fear. It was the silence after the knife, the silence known only by those who have lain on the altar and been freed by the hand of God. Later, another kind of silence enveloped the camp, not the silence of contemplation, nor of an unconsummated sacrifice, but the silence of grief. Sarah, the woman who laughed at the promise, who conceived in old age, who bore the son of the covenant, died. Her body, worn by years yet dignified by faith, was laid in a cave Abraham bought from the Hittites in the region of Hebron. The field of Machpelah became her final resting place, but also the first piece of land Abraham owned in the Promised Land. It was a tomb, but also a seed. For Isaac, his mother's death was a deep wound. Though already a young man, his soul was bound to Sarah with the tenderness of a miracle child. She had waited for him, dreamed of him, raised him, protected him. Her presence in the tent meant warmth, comfort, and guidance. When she closed her eyes for the last time, Isaac did not lose only a mother. He lost the most intimate link to his childhood. Grief plunged him into a silence even deeper than the one he carried from Moriah. Abraham saw him and understood that the young man needed more than comfort. He needed direction, hope, and a bride. Abraham, seasoned by years and sensitive to the voice of the Eternal, understood that the time had come. Isaac had to marry, but not just any woman. The inheritance of the promise was too sacred to be shared with a corrupted lineage. The Canaanite women, though numerous and near, were not an option. The spiritual corruption of their peoples and their foreign gods posed a direct threat to God's plan. So Abraham decided to send his most trusted servant, the elder Eliezer of Damascus, on a crucial mission, to seek, among his relatives, a wife for Isaac. The scene that follows is one of the most symbol-laden in all the patriarchal narratives. Abraham calls Eliezer and asks him to place his hand under his thigh. In our culture, this gesture may seem strange, even uncomfortable, but in the ancient world, it carried deep spiritual weight. The area of the thigh associated with descendants symbolized the generational covenant. By placing his hand there, the servant swore loyalty not only to Abraham, but to the very promise that lived in Isaac. It was an oath sealed with the bloodline of the future. "Go to my country and to my kindred," Abraham said, "and take from there a wife for my son." Eliezer departed with 10 camels, abundant gifts, and a heart full of responsibility. He knew that what he was about to do was not merely find a bride, but find the woman who would become the mother of a nation, the companion of the heir, the mother of the next generation of the covenant. The journey led him to the city of Nahor, in Mesopotamia. There, upon arriving at a well, instead of waiting for dramatic signs to fall from heaven, the servant prayed. He did not ask for theatrical wonders or extraordinary miracles. He asked for something simple, yet precise, that the young woman chosen by God would offer water not only to him, but also to his camels. In that quiet act of humble service, he would recognize the right heart. And then, as if heaven had answered instantly, Rebekah appeared. She was the daughter of Bethuel, a descendant of Nahor, Abraham's brother. Beautiful in appearance, pure, strong, not knowing who that traveler was or where he came from, she ran to give him water and then drew enough for all the camels. She did this without delay, without hesitation, with generosity. Every movement of hers seemed to move in rhythm with a higher will. Eliezer, astonished, said nothing more. He simply watched in silence as every detail of his prayer was fulfilled with divine precision. When he learned that she was a relative of Abraham, he fell in worship. The journey had not only succeeded, it had clearly been guided by the hand of God. When he told Rebekah's family the purpose of his mission, they, seeing the evident work of the Most High, allowed her to decide. And Rebekah, without hesitation, agreed to go. She left everything behind, her home, her land, her family, her future, for a promise she had not yet seen, for a husband she did not yet know, for an invisible yet powerful calling. Her faith matched that of Abraham, who had also left his land without knowing where he was going. Days later, at evening time, Isaac was walking in the field, meditating. His soul, still marked by the loss of his mother, sought comfort in the silence of creation. And then he saw her. Rebekah, riding on a camel, lifted her eyes and saw him as well. In that crossing of glances, something was sealed in heaven. She dismounted with humility, covered her face with a veil, and was led into the tent that had belonged to Sarah. In that space, which had once been the place of motherly comfort, Isaac now received the comfort of a wife. Isaac took Rebekah as his wife, and then for the first time in a long time, his heart was filled with comfort. It was not merely the beginning of a marriage, it was the rebirth of his soul. Rebekah did not merely fill a void, she brought the future with her. She was the woman chosen by God, not only to love Isaac, but to carry forward the story of a people that did not yet exist, but already burned in the heart of the eternal. Thus, Sarah's legacy did not end at the tomb. It continued in the tent Rebekah inherited, in the love awakened in Isaac, and in the lineage that would begin there. The legacy that would write the next chapter of sacred history. The sun was slowly setting over the hills of Canaan, tinting the sky with a soft amber glow. As the shadows lengthened across the dusty road, Isaac, the child of promise, walked silently through the fields. He had not gone out to tend flocks or oversee servants. That afternoon his soul was restless. Meditation had become his refuge since his mother's death, and the field his sanctuary. There he spoke with his father's God, revisited the promises that would one day be his, and, with a trembling voice, begged for guidance, relief, and companionship. In the distance, a small caravan approached, 10 loaded camels, a trail of dust rising behind them, and among them a firm and graceful silhouette, Rebekah. Isaac's eyes, accustomed to the harsh brightness of the desert, fixed on her. Something within him responded with deep certainty. It was her. Rebekah saw him too, and asked the servant who guided her, "Who is that man coming to meet us in the field?" When she heard that it was Isaac, the son of her future master, she dismounted from the camel with a mixture of reverence and hope, and covered her face with a veil, not out of mere obligation, but as a sign of modesty, devotion, and readiness. Every gesture spoke without words, as if she understood she was about to cross an eternal threshold. The servant approached, bowed before Isaac, and told him everything. The journey, the prayer at the well, the immediate answer, Rebekah's demeanor, each detail aligned by providence. Isaac listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on her. The woman remained at a respectful distance. She did not ask about her dowry, or about wealth, or about the exact measure of Isaac's possessions. Something greater was at stake. This was not a union born of convenience or strategy. It was the continuation of an eternal purpose. Then Isaac led her into his mother Sarah's tent. That gesture, heavy with symbolism, sealed a new beginning. The tent that had stood silent since Sarah's departure was once again filled with life, with the voice and presence of a woman. Isaac took Rebekah as his wife and loved her, not as someone who possesses, but as someone who discovers a long-awaited treasure. In her he found more than beauty or virtue. He found rest, comfort, and a new reason to look toward the future. The biblical account does not describe long conversations, poems at sunset, or romantic speeches, but in its brevity, it reveals something more powerful. Isaac loved her. A simple sentence that sums up the depth of a genuine bond born in heaven and confirmed on earth. Their love was not built on political interests, nor was it the result of an alliance between tribes. It was true and pure love, upheld by divine providence. In those days, marriages were often alliances between clans, strategies to secure land, descendants, or power. But the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah broke that pattern. It was a marriage sealed by prayer, guided by obedience, and confirmed by the Spirit of God. A union not born from human schemes, but from the very center of God's will. Isaac, who had remained silent for so long, began to be healed. His soul, wounded by his mother's death, was comforted by the warmth of a woman who came from far away, yet whose heart was already in tune with his destiny. In Rebekah, he found not only a wife, but a partner in purpose, the future mother of the bearers of the promise. Sarah's tent became a home again. The days once more carried promise and a new rhythm. Laughter echoed again within the hardened leather walls. And though Sarah's voice was no longer heard, her legacy lived on in every act of Rebekah, who, without fully realizing it, took her place in the great story of redemption. Thus began the story of Isaac and Rebekah, not with blind passion or fleeting fire, but with a serene encounter, sustained by faith and guided by the hand of God. Love at first sight, yes, but a love that would last a lifetime, because it was sown in the fertile soil of obedience and promise. The years passed in Isaac and Rebekah's tent, and the promise that united them did not fade. But it began to weigh heavily. Each morning brought a sigh, and each night a silence longer than the one before. Rebekah, the woman chosen by God, the one who had left her home by faith, who had become the consolation of the heir of the covenant, could not conceive. The womb that was meant to carry the next generation of the promise remained unchanged. Infertility, once again, seemed to repeat an unbreakable pattern. Sarah, her mother-in-law, had also been barren. God had waited decades before granting her a son, Abraham. Now Rebekah walked the same road, carrying in her heart the same burden, the feeling of being stuck in the middle of an eternal purpose. Day after day, she passed her hands over her belly, hoping to feel some change, some sign, some movement of life. But nothing happened. Her frustration was not only personal, but spiritual. She knew her role was more than that of a wife. She was meant to be the mother of the chosen people. But Isaac did not surrender to despair, nor did he seek human solutions, as his father had done in begetting Ishmael through Hagar. He chose another way. Isaac prayed, not a superficial or mechanical prayer. The biblical text is clear. Isaac prayed to YHWH on behalf of his wife because she was barren. It was not an isolated act, but a sustained cry, a constant intercession. For 20 years, Isaac lifted his voice to heaven. He did not seek another woman, did not pressure Rebekah, did not devise an alternative plan. He waited, interceded, trusted. In his prayer, Isaac revealed a trait of his character that is rarely highlighted. Quiet, yes, but deeply spiritual. He was not a man of grand gestures, nor of fiery speeches like his father, but his faith was firm, calm, and persevering. In the midst of his plea, his faith rested on a deep understanding of who God is, not only the one who promises, but the one who answers in his time. His intercessory prayer was not only an act of love for his wife, but a demonstration of his understanding of God's role in the story they were living. Then, after 2 decades of waiting, a miracle once again touched the tent of the covenant. Rebekah conceived, but what should have been unbroken joy soon turned into uneasiness. In the first months, she felt an inner battle intensify. These were not simple movements. They were sharp jolts, thrusts, a constant struggle that gave her no rest or relief. Something abnormal was happening. The womb that had been silent for years had become a battlefield. In desperation, she went to inquire of the Lord. She did not go to the midwives, nor to the women of the camp. She went directly to the source, to the God who had opened to her the doors of motherhood. And the answer she received was not merely strange, it was prophetic. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be separated. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. God was not speaking about mere children, but about nations, not about a passing rivalry, but about a permanent division. Even before they were born, the twins Rebekah carried in her womb already belonged to a story greater than themselves. Esau and Jacob would not merely be brothers, they would become the beginning of 2 paths, 2 natures, 2 destinies in tension. Why did they struggle in the womb? Because their very existence represented a spiritual conflict. Esau, the firstborn, strong and impetuous, would be born first, but he would not be the chosen one. Jacob, the second, the one who would come out holding his brother's heel, would be the bearer of the promise. From the womb, their souls mirrored this eternal struggle. Flesh versus spirit, impulse versus faith, brute strength versus divine election. Rebekah, even amid the discomfort of violent movements, carried within herself a sacred mystery. The womb that had waited 20 years had now become the stage for God's will in action. It was not simply about twins. It was not a passing struggle, but a raw and unfiltered revelation. The older shall serve the younger. An inversion of the natural order, a declaration that, in the kingdom of God, choice is not based on strength, birth, or human privilege, but on divine sovereignty. When Isaac saw his wife pregnant, he knew his prayer had been heard, but he also understood that his home was no longer merely a refuge of love. It had become a training ground for a prophetic battle that would not end at birth, but would stretch on for generations. The silence of the womb had ended, but now a new stage had begun, not only raising children but shaping destinies. Infertility had become an opportunity for intercession, and prayer had not brought 1 child, but 2. 2 who would struggle not only with each other, but at the very core of biblical history. For at times, God's plan moves along the margins of what is expected, And in that womb, shaken by conflict, the next chapter of an eternal promise was being conceived. When the day of birth arrived, the camp trembled. Rebekah's tent filled with midwives and jars of hot water. Servants ran back and forth, attentive to every cry, every breath, every sign. This was no ordinary birth. They had waited more than 20 years for this moment. The womb that had remained barren for so long now opened, not for one, but for 2 children. And when the first child was born, his appearance surprised everyone. Reddish, covered with hair, as though already clothed. They named him Esau, the firstborn, but before they could finish tending to the first, the second appeared with determination. Strangely, his tiny hand was gripping his brother's heel, as if refusing to let him go out first, as if the struggle that had formed in the womb now became visible. This second child was called Jacob, a name that became a living prophecy, the one who takes by the heel, the supplanter. The years passed, and what had begun in the womb as struggle continued in daily life. Esau became strong and skilled with the bow, a born hunter. He loved the open country, the smell of leather, the thrill of the chase and pursuit. He was impulsive, rough, passionate. Jacob, on the other hand, was calm, more introspective, careful. He preferred the tents, the stories of the camp, the warmth of home. While one yielded to instinct, the other pondered the details. This difference in temperament was no accident. It was the tangible reflection of a deeper spiritual reality. The prophecy Rebekah had felt in her womb was woven into every gesture, every decision, every reaction. The struggle of the twins was the reflection of 2 opposing natures, flesh and spirit, earthly and heavenly. Esau represented the impulsive man, ruled by the immediate. Jacob, despite his flaws, embodied the seeker, restless for the eternal, longing for the blessing. But the most disturbing aspect of this story was not only the conflict between the brothers, but Isaac's posture in the face of God's choice. Even though God had declared that the older would serve the younger, Isaac seemed attached to the firstborn. There is no record that he questioned the divine will, but neither do we see him as a man who actively affirmed it. He remained silent, a silence that, this time, did not reflect contemplation, but possibly denial. Isaac loved Esau not because he was ignorant of the prophecy, but because he found in him a reflection of what he understood as strength, virility, and skill. Esau was a man of the open country, the one who brought fresh meat, the one who filled his days with the thrill of the hunt. The biblical text says it simply, Isaac loved Esau because he ate the game he hunted. In contrast, Rebekah loved Jacob, perhaps because she had felt the echo of the promise spoken while she carried him in her womb. Isaac's heart, which once climbed the mountain in complete obedience, now seemed divided. He did not rebel against God, but neither did he embrace him with love. His decision was exactly what God had foretold. His love for Esau seemed to cloud his judgment. And in that favoritism, without realizing it, Isaac began to weave the threads of a drama that would later explode with force. Why did Isaac love Esau more? Perhaps because he wished to see continuity in his firstborn, something natural. Perhaps he hoped the promise would be fulfilled through a logical process, without surprises, without a reversal of roles. Esau was the first, the strong one, the one who provided for Isaac, accustomed to silence and calm. Esau represented stability and security, but God does not move by human logic. He chose Jacob before he was even born, not because of his merits, but because of his own eternal purpose. The scriptures, always precise in their silences, do not describe a conversation between Isaac and Rebekah about this prophecy. But what was obvious is that, while Rebekah kept God's words in her heart and saw in Jacob a prophetic destiny, Isaac continued to favor the son he could feel, smell, and taste. The conflict was not only between brothers, it was also a gap between 2 ways of seeing life, one guided by the senses and the other by faith. Thus, Isaac's household became the setting for a deeply human story, where love, favoritism, promises and conflicts were intertwined like invisible threads. The struggle between Jacob and Esau was not merely personal. It was the reflection of a spiritual tension that would define not only what was to come, but also what already existed, not only their lives, but the destiny of generations. For from the beginning, God chose the younger, not because he deserved it, but because in his story, a grace would be revealed, defying the logic of the world. And although Isaac had not yet fully understood, the Eternal's plan continued advancing, weaving its pattern even amid human frailty. For the promise does not stop. Even when the hearts of those who carry it waver, time does not stop. The seasons came and went, like the wind over the fields of Gerar. And Isaac's life continued on its course, marked by the routine of the shepherds, the care of the flocks, and the tasks of the clan. But times of abundance were suddenly replaced by silence. A devastating famine fell upon the land like a dry, cracked veil. A famine like the one that in the past had driven his father Abraham down to Egypt, and he had returned when the region was struck. The wells dried up faster than normal. The crops did not sprout, and the pastures turned to dust. The desert spread like a threat. Silence. Isaac, head of the clan, felt the weight of responsibility. The decisions he made would affect his entire family. And in that critical moment, memories of his father flooded him. Abraham had faced a similar situation and gone down to Egypt. There he found food, but also hardship. Isaac wrestled with this inwardly. He had to follow the same path, repeat the pattern, and seek help where there always seemed to be supplies. But then, like lightning in the midst of the drought, he appeared to him, not through a messenger nor by the voice of a prophet. God himself appeared before Isaac with words that rang out like the echo of an ancient promise, now renewed. Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land I will show you. Live as a foreigner in this land, and I will be with you. I will go with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands. I will confirm the oath I swore to Abraham your father. Isaac stopped. He needed nothing more. He asked for no signs, demanded no guarantees. God not only spoke to him, he renewed the covenant with him. The same oath Abraham had carried was now passed directly to him. Isaac, the son of the promise, became the active bearer of that promise. He was no longer the young man protected by the father. Now he was the man chosen by God, the new link in an eternal chain. Isaac's response was immediate. He did not go down to Egypt, not because he did not want to, nor because he lacked the means or the opportunity, but because the voice of God had been clearly heard. He remained in Gerar, Philistine land, a foreign region that promised no stability, yet was now his destiny, because God had placed him there, and it was in that land, not in the comfort of Egypt, that the heavens began to open over his life. The scriptures record that Isaac sowed in that land and reaped 100-fold that year. It was not normal, not natural, it was supernatural. Where others suffered, he prospered, not by personal skill, but by the direct blessing of God. The wells he dug sprang up with water, the lands he touched produced. As a result, his herds multiplied and his wealth grew beyond what the Philistines could tolerate. Yet the true secret was not in the wells, nor in the crops. It was in quiet obedience. Isaac was not a man of great speeches or heroic military deeds. He is not known for building colossal altars or raising statues or cities. His life was one of quiet obedience, of daily faithfulness, walking step by step according to what God had said. That quiet obedience was, in fact, his greatest strength, because in the kingdom of God it is not always noise that changes history, but the faithful. The renewed covenant marked a before and after. Isaac was no longer only the miraculous son, nor merely the blessed husband. Now he was the direct recipient of the promises. God spoke to him, gave him instructions, and walked with him not only once but many times, appearing at different stages of his life to confirm to him, "Do not fear, for I am with you." This covenant secured not only the land, but also the descendants and the divine presence. Isaac became an even more robust figure in sacred history, not because of his conquests, but because of his consistency. In the midst of scarcity, he chose to trust. Under pressure, he chose to stay. In the midst of silence, he chose to believe. And so, while the land burned under the sun, the neighboring villages watched in wonder at the growth of that foreign shepherd, Isaac. He remained steadfast. His obedience, his quiet faith, and his sensitivity to the voice of God turned a famine into a platform for the fulfillment of the covenant. This was the covenant that changed everything, not because it was new, but because for the first time Isaac made it his own. It was no longer Abraham's faith, now it was his. And through that quiet faithfulness, the story of redemption continued on its course, woven not in battle cries, but by the steady steps of a man who chose to obey in the hidden and be blessed in the visible. The land of Gerar, fertile and strange, had become the new phase of Isaac's life. God had blessed him there in the midst of famine, multiplying his herds and making him prosper where others barely survived. But with abundance came envious eyes as well. The suspicion of neighbors, the invisible pressure of being the foreigner who flourishes while the natives wither. Isaac, the man of quiet obedience, began to feel the weight of the environment around him. He was in a foreign land, surrounded by Philistines, and his wife, Rebekah, beautiful, steadfast, and dignified, also drew attention. The memory of his father Abraham came to mind. The story told by the fireside when his mother Sarah was presented as a sister and not a wife before pharaohs and kings returned to him like a persistent whisper. And then Isaac fell into the same error. When questioned by the men of the place about Rebekah, he replied, "She is my sister." It was not a slip or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate lie, born of fear. He feared for his life. He feared the men would kill him to take her. And so he repeated his father's pattern, the same strategy, the same lack of faith that God would protect him. It was a lie from fear, an act of spiritual weakness in the midst of a story marked by divine promises. Time passed until one day Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out a window and saw Isaac caressing Rebekah in a way that made it clear they were not siblings. He immediately summoned the patriarch and confronted him. "You almost made someone among the people sin because of your lie," he reproached him. The rebuke came paradoxically from a pagan king to a man of the covenant. Isaac, who should have been light, had dimmed his witness. But even in this stumble, he was not disqualified. God did not withdraw his blessing. He did not abandon him. This episode reveals a great lesson. Authentic faith is not always perfect. Isaac, the heir of the promises, the son of the miracle, was also human. His fears, though unjustified in light of God's protection, led him to falter. But the Most High, who knows the heart, did not turn away from him, because God's faithfulness does not depend on human perfection, but on his own unchanging nature. After the incident, tension with the Philistines grew. His wealth bred resentment, and his enemies began to stop up the wells his father Abraham had dug. That act was not merely agricultural sabotage. It was a way of erasing memory, of declaring that Abraham and his family had no right to the land, of denying the legacy God had promised. But Isaac did not remain still. One by one, he reopened the wells his father had left, giving them the same names Abraham had given them. It was not only the recovery of water sources, but a spiritual restoration, an act of prophecy. Each well he unearthed was an affirmation of the covenant, a declaration of permanence. Though they tried to erase him, Isaac restored. Though they rejected him, he dug. The restoration of the wells symbolized the reactivation of purpose, the continuity of the calling. It was a way of saying, "Here we continue. The God of Abraham still lives. His promises are still in motion. This land has been given to us, and here we will dig until water springs forth, even if the ground resists us. But the Philistines did not remain quiet. They quarreled over every well that was opened. The first he called Esek, contention. The second, Sitna, enmity. Isaac did not answer with violence. He did not fight. He moved away and dug another well. And over this one, there was no dispute. He called it Rehoboth, which means broad places, saying, "Now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." There, amid conflict, in a land that was not his, Isaac found peace, not because the environment changed, but because he chose not to fight for conflict, but to move toward the promise. And then, as if heaven answered his perseverance, God appeared again. This time he said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you, and I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of Abraham my servant." There was no rebuke, no judgment for the lie or the fear, only a reaffirmation. I am with you. Isaac built an altar there, called upon the name of the Lord, and kept digging a well because that was his life, to worship, to trust, and to dig. The deception in Gerar was left behind, not as a stain, but as a trial overcome. Isaac was not perfect, but he was faithful in continuing to walk forward. His mistakes did not stop him, and God, in his grace, blessed him in spite of them, because the covenant that sustained him was not based on his strength, but on the promise of a God who does not fail. Years do not pass in vain. The life that once pulsed with vigor in Isaac's steps as he crossed the fields of Gerar, digging wells amid conflict, now moved along more slowly. The body that had once climbed the mountain at Abraham's side was now frail, and his eyes, which once saw Rebekah from afar, had grown dim with old age. Scripture says that Isaac had grown old, and his eyes had become so dim that he could not see. But beyond physical blindness, a spiritual blindness began to emerge as well, a blurring of the divine purpose that surrounded his household. Isaac knew his time was running out. He felt the weight of death drawing near, and understood that he needed to bless the heir before he departed. According to patriarchal tradition, the blessing of the firstborn was not a mere wish, but a prophetic proclamation, a transfer of spiritual and material inheritance. The patriarch prepared to perform this sacred act, but he did so guided by the attachment of his heart, not by divine instruction. For although God had declared from the womb that the older would serve the younger, Isaac desired to bless Esau. The same Esau who had sold his birthright for a bowl of lentils. The same Esau who took foreign wives without counsel. Even so, Isaac loved him, preferred him, admired him for his strength, skill, and manner. He was to Isaac the visible son, the sensory son, the son of the hunt. Isaac called Esau in secret without consulting Rebekah and said to him, "Take your weapons, go out to the field, hunt something for me, and prepare me a stew such as I love. Then I will bless you before I die." But Rebekah heard. She had not forgotten the prophecy. She kept in her heart the words she had received when the twins struggled within her womb. She knew Jacob, the younger, was the chosen one. But instead of trusting that God would fulfill his word in his time, she chose to intervene with human cunning. Rebekah called Jacob and revealed the plan. "Bring me 2 young goats from the flock. I will prepare the food the way your father likes, and you will go in pretending to be Esau to receive the blessing." Jacob hesitated. "What if he discovers me? He will curse me instead of blessing me." But Rebekah would not yield. "Let your curse be on me, my son." Thus began the great deception. Jacob covered himself with goatskins to imitate his brother's hairy body. He put on Esau's clothes, took the dish, and entered his father's tent. Isaac, though blind, was suspicious. "How did you find game so quickly?" he asked. "The Lord your God brought it to me," Jacob replied. The voice did not match exactly, but the smell of Esau clung to the garments, and the feel of hairy arms convinced the patriarch. Overcoming his doubts, Isaac blessed Jacob. And it was no ordinary blessing. It was a prophetic proclamation that sealed destiny. May the dew of heaven and the richness of the earth be yours. May peoples and nations bow down to you. Be lord over your brothers. Moments later, Esau entered carrying his food, his face sweaty from the hunt, everything prepared. Yet the inevitable had already happened. Isaac trembled violently as he realized what had occurred. "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing," Esau cried out with a shattered voice. "Do you not have a blessing for me also, my father?" But Isaac did not take back what he had spoken. He blessed Esau too, yes, but with words that carried distance and a season of subordination. The damage was done. The destiny had been sealed. Was that it? Did everything flow from the will of God? The answer is not simple. God does not approve lies or deception to accomplish his plans, and yet, even amid human imperfection, his will is fulfilled. Rebekah and Jacob acted with cunning, fueled by favoritism and Isaac's blindness. Esau's spiritual negligence was also part of the tapestry. And still, God's eternal plan continued moving forward. In his old age, Isaac stood at the center of a tension between human tradition and divine choice. He wanted to act according to the natural order, blessing the older. But heaven had another purpose. Scripture does not show Isaac as rebellious, but as a man clinging to what he could feel. His role in this election was passive, yet also prophetic. Despite the deception, he did not revoke the blessing. He finally recognized that Jacob was the chosen one, and with that acceptance, he surrendered silently, fulfilling his role within the mystery of God's sovereignty. Thus the blessing was given, but not without consequences. What began as a secret act in the family tent ended in tears, hatred, and separation. Esau swore to kill Jacob, and Jacob had to flee, beginning a long exile. The enemy was not out there, but at home, not in the form of armies or pagan nations, but in the folds of favoritism, deception, distrust, and fear. Even in that desolate environment, God was present, writing his story, using not only the successes, but also the errors of men, so that his plan of redemption might be fulfilled. For that is the nature of grace. It turns deception into purpose, blindness into direction, and chaos into prophetic destiny. The air in Isaac's tent was heavy, not from the heat of the day, nor from the weariness of years, but from the weight of destiny that had just fallen upon him. Isaac was trembling, but it was not an ordinary tremor. It was a tremor of the soul. He trembled as if his very insides had been shaken by the certainty that, without realizing it, he had spoken with authority from above. The blessing he had given was not a routine act. It was a heavenly proclamation in a human mouth, and there was no turning back. When Esau came in with his game, his face flushed from exertion, his body still carrying the scent of the open country, believing he would receive the blessing he considered his by right, he found his father pale, confused, and distraught. "Who are you?" Isaac asked, though he already knew the answer. The tragedy broke open in that moment. Esau, understanding what had happened, let out a cry that was not only pain, but an ancestral wound, as though something had shattered in the deepest part of his being. "Bless me too, my father." But Isaac did not. He did not revoke the blessing. He did not retract it. He did not correct the destiny. In the midst of confusion, he recognized that the will of God had manifested even through deception. "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing, and he shall be blessed," was his final affirmation. It did not matter how it happened. It did not matter who plotted. The blessing had been released, and it could not be undone. That decision reveals something profound in Isaac. In that moment of revelation, he understood that what God had determined before the twins were born had been fulfilled, despite his own desires and favoritism. The silence that had accompanied much of his life now broke, giving way to surrender. Isaac did not fight what had happened. He recognized that God had not erred. In Jacob, the younger, the usurper, lay the future of the covenant. Esau, in turn, did not accept this outcome. His pain turned into hatred, What he had lost was not a simple spoken blessing, but the spiritual inheritance, the line of the Messiah, the divine favor that carried irreversible authority. He cried out for a second chance, but his heart had already shown contempt for the birthright long before, when he sold it for a plate of food. Esau's cry was real, sincere, human, but it did not have the force required to reverse God's plan. And when his father gave him words, they were not of glory, but of subordination. Your dwelling shall be away from the fatness of the earth, and you shall serve your brother. Esau's bitterness became violent resolve. The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. The family tragedy had reached its breaking point. What had been sown in the womb now erupted into hatred and the desire for vengeance. Rebekah, learning of the danger, urged Jacob to flee, and so began the exile of the heir of the promise. But before he departed, something unexpected happened. Isaac, who had witnessed everything, called Jacob again, not as a victim of deception, but as a conscious patriarch. There were no disguises now, no doubtful voices, no hands covered with goatskins. Jacob presented himself as himself, and his father willingly blessed him a second time, this time with full clarity, this time with spiritual vision. May God Almighty bless you, make you fruitful, multiply you, and give you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your descendants, so that you may inherit the land in which you dwell as a foreigner. This was the irrevocable reaffirmation. Isaac no longer blessed by mistake, nor by confusion, nor by cunning. Now he did so with full conviction that Jacob was the chosen one. He sent him not merely to escape a vengeful brother, but to find a wife and to continue the sacred line, as he himself had done years before. What changed in Isaac? Perhaps for the first time, he saw Jacob not as the manipulator, but as the legitimate bearer of the eternal purpose. He saw in him not only the younger son, but the man destined to be the channel of blessing. And in that recognition, Isaac aligned himself fully with God's plan, abandoning his own preferences. The blind patriarch, who once loved what he could touch and smell, now saw with the eyes of the soul. He reached the point where faith overcame favoritism, where discernment replaced habit, where obedience, though late, was restored to heaven's order. The blessing was given, and it was not taken back. For when God decides to raise someone up, no matter the deceptions or human errors, his will cannot be frustrated. In accepting this, Isaac became a true patriarch, not only by inheritance, but by faith. Thus Jacob departed into exile, carrying with him not only a promise, but also a blessing sealed by heaven and irrevocably confirmed by his father. Isaac lived 180 years, a long and full life, a witness to generations, covenants fulfilled, sons divided, and wells restored. And yet Isaac's story, when read between the lines of Scripture, seems brief, almost secondary, as though diluted between the epics of his father Abraham and the adventures of his son Jacob. There are no great battles in his life, no change of name, no sweeping journeys, no prolonged heavenly dreams, no dramatic confrontations with God. Isaac seems to walk in the shadows, but those shadows are full of light. Unlike Abraham, who was called from a distant land and passed through many trials that forged his identity as the father of faith, or Jacob, who wrestled with men and with God, who fled, loved, suffered, and gave rise to the 12 tribes of Israel. Isaac's life appears to be a life of continuity. We do not see him founding anything new. We do not see him leaving Canaan. His journey is marked more by stability than by conquest, and it is precisely there that his greatness lies. Isaac was the bridge, the link between the foundation of the covenant with Abraham and the expansion of the covenant with Jacob. He was neither the beginning nor the end, but the hinge that kept the promise on course. In times of conflict, famine, human error, and divine silence, it was in his life that the promise began to take the shape of a legacy and not merely a matter of individual faith. Isaac inherited the land not by conquest, but by remaining. The land promised to Abraham was inhabited by Isaac in obedience. He did not leave Canaan, not even in times of famine, because God told him to stay, and he obeyed. He did not build cities, but he dug wells, symbols of life, provision, and permanence. Wells that had been filled in by the enemy and that he restored, renaming each one of them as if declaring, "What God gave to my father will not be forgotten." Isaac's obedience was quiet, but profound. While Abraham responded with faith in the impossible and Jacob wrestled between deception and transformation, Isaac moved forward, straight ahead, with steady steps. His life was a kind of living altar, not adorned with fire or smoke, but with substance. He remained in the land with his wife, raised his children, dealt with family tensions, his own mistakes and the mistakes of others, yet he never departed from the framework of the promise. Perhaps that is why his story seems small in human eyes, because his legacy was not written with great feats, but with faithfulness in the everyday. And that is where many fail. It is easy to obey when fire falls from heaven or when a voice resounds from on high. But Isaac obeyed when God was silent. He lived in the interlude between Abraham's burning vision and Jacob's prophetic dream. Isaac heard the echo of both realities and did not turn aside. And as for his silence, Isaac spoke little compared to the other patriarchs. There are no records of grand speeches from him. He is not seen negotiating with kings or confronting crowds. His voice is faint, but his impact is deep. For sometimes silence is not passivity, but reverence. Isaac listened more than he spoke and walked more than he ran. His faith was deep precisely because it did not need the ornament of words. The power of silence and obedience became his hallmark. In a world where the anxiety to leave drives many to act without direction, Isaac reminds us that staying is also a way of moving forward. Digging into the earth where others have closed the springs can be more powerful than building temples in a foreign land. Living where God has placed you, even if it seems small, is obedience to the God of eternity. Isaac did not found a nation, but he sustained it. He did not have constant heavenly visions, but he never stopped believing. He was not the loudest, but his faith has echoed through the centuries. When his eyes, already dim with the passing of time, finally closed, Isaac died in peace, old and full of days, having fulfilled his purpose in the divine story, not as the most visible, but as the most steadfast, the one who kept the promise alive in the midst of the desert, the one who inherited it, sustained it, and passed it on, a quiet patriarch whose legacy still resounds. Isaac, the child of the miracle, the young man who climbed onto the altar in obedience, the faithful husband, the father of nations, the quiet patriarch, lived not to conquer, but to preserve. His life, often overlooked, reveals itself as a firm pillar in the history of God's plan. He did not need wars or great signs to leave a mark. His impact was subtler, deeper, more constant. He was the bridge over which the promise crossed from Abraham to Jacob, from the initial promise to the expansion that would give rise to Israel. Isaac teaches us that daily faithfulness also builds eternity, that not every call to action needs a divine intervention to be legitimate. Sometimes quiet obedience is enough. Stay where God told you to stay. Love only one woman. Dig the same wells again and again, and trust even when the sky seems silent. Isaac's secret was not what he did, but what he represented. A guardian of a legacy, a protector of a promise, the quiet yet steadfast link in a chain that centuries later would lead to Jesus Christ himself, the true promised Son. And now that you know this untold story, I earnestly ask you not to let this lesson be lost. Subscribe for more stories and deep biblical passages like this one. Comment which one impacted you most, the life of Isaac. And don't forget to share this video so more people can see it. Discover the power of obedient silence in faith. I'll see you in the next chapter of the eternal story.